podcasts are about power. The power to define and the power to decide. From protests to power gain, we welcome you to our fight for political and economic freedoms here in America. We're almost there. Welcome to this week's episode. Welcome to episode 1. During our first podcast, we will explain the importance of the past in determining the present conditions of the Black community. Listeners should know that stories being told and the history being shared are based on lived experiences of those who engaged and those who are engaging in the struggle for human and civil rights. Welcome to episode 1. During our first podcast, we will explain the importance of the past in determining the present conditions of the Black community. Listeners should know that stories being told and the history being shared are based on lived experiences of those who engaged and those who are engaging in the struggle for human and civil rights.
After 64 years, I'm really surprised that I'm still involved in those things that are necessary to change America. When I came to Howard University in 1960, I was 19 years old. And my first thing is I wanted to be like any other student. One of the things I would do, I would go party, I'd go to the card room, I played dirty hearts, I played double-deck pinochle. I was involved in all sorts of student activities until a number of people came up and said, now, you are in this card room. Do you know what's going on in the South? You know what's happening at the Greyhound stations? Do you know what's happening at trailways? People are being beat up, they're being brutalized. People are sitting in at the Woolworths. What are you going to do? So there was a challenge to get me out of the card room onto the picket line, and also trying to make statements about what was going on. I reluctantly, like most students, I was 19A. I'll try it one time. I'll just get out there and one time, picket the Woolworths. One time, go down and picket the Greyhound station. One time, picket the Trailway station. And 64 years later, here I am, still continuing to try to make the changes that are necessary in America. So, my sense is, Charles, you're now for 34 years old. I'm 83, so there's a big, 50-year difference. But you now are engaged in the same kind of struggle that I was engaged in. What do you see? What's your perspective, and how did you get involved?
First of all, excited to be here in the conversation with you and Insay. There are a few rooms that I've been prouder to be in. I'll tell you, I'm really excited to have this conversation. And when I hear about your journey, I am awe-inspired. All but for one part, that you went to Howard University. There's a college in Georgia on the Red Clay Hill, Morehouse College. I think you would have enjoyed your time there. But with that being said, growing up in Jackson, Mississippi, I had a level of privilege that most Black folks didn't. But when I got to high school, there was this club called the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Club. And we began to discuss things that we couldn't talk about in the classroom. But, as a 16-year-old student, I realized quickly, along with the other students, that there was limitations to what we knew. And so we would invite folks into the classroom. Two individuals that we invited into the classroom, one was Derek Johnson, who's now the national president of NAACP, along with Nashombi Lambright-Haynes, who serves as executive director of One Voice in Mississippi. At the time, she was over the ACLU. And it, is kind of interesting, a funny story about that. I actually started an email, started my email address so that I could email Derek to invite him to the classroom. So he was the first person I ever emailed. And so, but saying that to say, a 16-year-old student wanting to have these conversations around civil rights and civil liberties. What I know now that I didn't know then is that the conversations that we were having, the activism and the organizing that we were doing, we were a part of a continuum. And as I reflect on that, some close to 20 years later, I'm just proud to say that the SNCC Legacy Project and the SNCC Legacy is one that, has upheld for the last 60 years. And I'm sure that it will be, young people 60 years from now talking about this continuum that they are a part of that you all started. So I'm just honored to be a part of this conversation.
So, Nsé, you're a little different than both Charles and myself. You were not born in the United States.
I was
And
not.
so tell us about your journey and how did you get here given, the circuitous routes that one can take?
Well, as a poor immigrant kid, I was not educated in elite institutions like Howard University or Morehouse, that school on the Red Hill. You say?
Oh, yeah.
I'm a public school kid. I immigrated with my family when I was a child from Nigeria, and was raised in Southwest Atlanta. I tell people I'm a Southerner twice. From Southern Nigeria down at Calabar, Port Harcourt. And when I think about sort of my journey to become an American, a U.S. citizen, my journey to, become an adult, et cetera, that it really has always been clear to me that sort of the Black Americans, and particularly the way that my family was embraced, the way that we made community. You live in Atlanta, you grew up in Atlanta, you're educated in Atlanta. You can't, throw a stick without hitting somebody that claims that they marched with Martin Luther King. And it's really, really funny now that I am in community and have had an opportunity to build with the sort of the architects and the leaders of the SNCC Legacy Project, and to look at original documents. It really makes you question, were you really there? But I say all that to say that learning that, I wanted to go to college. I needed to be able to pay for college. I was not a citizen, that I was a green card holder. My mom got a third job so that she could hire an immigration lawyer. And I prepared us for the citizenship exam because we were not going to fail. This just was not going to happen. And I think that in the process of becoming a U.S. citizen, in a process of taking the oath of allegiance to the Constitution, et cetera, that there's a lot that you learn about what the founding fathers and the framers of the Constitution intended for citizens to have access to, rights and responsibilities. And so there was all this rhetoric that I was ingesting, and then there was the reality that was experienced by people who looked like me. So there was a huge gap between the rhetoric of freedom and liberty for all and the reality of Black folks in this country. And I have spent my time since becoming a citizen trying to close the gap between the rhetoric and the reality, particularly for poor folks, immigrants, and Black folks in the Deep South.
The thing that holds us together, even though we're in different generations and different times, is that all three of us have been organizers. You in Georgia, you're in Mississippi, and myself in Alabama. And I think, the journey for me has probably been longer than it has been for you. Because as I said, I started out being dragged out of the card room and to picket at the Trailway station and Greyhound station. But then I decided to go on sit-ins myself. And sit-ins in Washington, D.C., sit-ins in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, sit-ins in all over the place. And so that there was a whole thing of direct action, trying to make the change when George Wallace would say, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. We would say freedom now. And we challenge, so there were two mindsets, going at each other in terms of what this country is going to be, whether it's going to be about segregation, but whether it was going to be about freedom. And so we went back and forth in that battle. And at the end of the day, we prevailed. The African-American community prevailed because freedom now, prevailed over the question of segregation. But even though and Ms. Baker used to tell us, as we were young veterans in SNCC, that you're fighting for more than a hamburger. And even if you get all that public accommodations, even if you don't have to sit on the back of the bus, even if you don't have to wait outside in order to eat, you're now going to have to do other things. And the big question for us in that was next was the question of the vote. One person, one vote. So I'd like to hear, maybe and say you can, you're probably the most recent in terms of your experiences and how fundamental your experiences has been to what America is today in 2024. Tell us about your organizing efforts and what it is you see the importance of really centering your work in terms of community, in terms of organizing, in terms of bringing the community along to make the difference.
You're right. Up until about a year and a half ago, I ran an organization called the New Georgia Project, and it's probably best known for having helped about 700,000 young people and people of color register to vote in all 159 of Georgia's counties. I feel like that work is impactful for a lot of reasons. The reasons that people probably know is because in 2020, Georgia went to President Biden and hadn't gone for a Democrat in 30 years. And what it also did was give President Biden a governing trifecta. Because of that work, Georgians were able to elect Raphael Warnock, who is Georgia's first Black senator. Georgians were able to elect John Ossoff to the United States Senate, who's a 33-year-old Jewish kid from the North Atlanta suburbs. And together, they were able to pass the Rescue Act, right? And all these things, eliminate child poverty for some time, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the results of the work that we do, and that's why people think that it's important. But to me, why the work that we do in Georgia is important and why organizing around the vote is important is because we are looking to be powerful, right? That have control over our lives, to have a say in the communities that we're building in our cities, in our country. And so people have visions for themselves. There are things that they hate that they want to stop, and that there are things that they want for themselves and their communities and their families. And as opposed to being acted upon, we have a vision for Black people. We have a vision for, quite frankly, a multiracial democracy in the Deep South, where the will of the people is not only reflected in the results of elections, but the will of the people is reflected in the policies that exist and the lives that we live, and people having access to high quality education and clean water, right? And the basics of life. And so, I tell people all the time when I'm trying to be cheeky, I don't even really care about the vote, right? I care about being powerful. I care about having all of the tools in our tool belt in order to build the lives that we deserve for ourselves and for our families and for our communities. Full stop.
Yeah. So Charles, using the concept that Nsé just talked about, this whole discussion about how you organize within this new reality, especially if you're in the South and you're trying to get big things done across statewide. Give us a sense of what you tried to do with the Mississippi Ballot Initiative. And even though it did not succeed at the end, the processes and the infrastructure that you had to put in place is really important as we go forward for the future. So help us understand what you try to do so that as people begin to think about the future, they need to think about it's not only going on demonstrations, it's not going on picket lines like we did before. We're much more sophisticated. We have many more political tools that in order to achieve our goals, as Nsé said, defend what we achieve politically and move forward, with our economic interests. So my sense, tell us what kind of things were you trying to do with the Mississippi Ballot Initiative that needs to begin to take us to the new levels that we need to be engaged in?
Yeah, great question. I appreciate it tremendously. I tell you, as we are thinking about this conversation with SNCC Legacy Project, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Hollis Watkins, who recently transitioned. I know was a great friend of yours, a mentor of mine, a mentor of so many folks in Mississippi. And so when I thought about his mentorship and the architecture of his teaching, it was through storytelling. And so he would often tell this story about being in Greenwood, Mississippi, back, I want to say it was 1963, 64, where you all were trying to register folks to vote. and you just wanted a place to meet. And so as you were thinking about wanting this place to meet, you said, okay, naturally, the Black church is a place that we all could go to. So he met with just about every pastor in the area, and just like a pastor will do, he said yes without saying, he said no without saying yes. And so with that being said, he was struggling. There was, and so as he's walking through this neighborhood in Greenwood, Mississippi, there's a little old lady on the porch to see him looking defeated. And she calls him over and she says, son, well, what's the problem? And he says, well, we're trying to register people to vote. I want to, have a space to have a meeting. And she says, oh, well, you can have this meeting in my church. And he's thinking, after she names the church, this was the last church I went to where the pastor said yes while also saying no. And so she told him, come by the next day. And as you come by the next day, around noontime, I'll have the keys for you. And what happened in that is that he very anxiously was there early next day, right as noon. She reached in her purse as she saw him, or a bag, as he said, as he saw him approaching, and handed him the keys to the church. The reason why I bring that story into the room and bring Hollis into the room, because I think about organizing at that time. One thing that we were trying to do was collect signatures. So, at that particular time, in order to put an initiative on the ballot in Mississippi, you had to collect a little over 100,000 signatures. Our goal was to collect 200,000 across the state. And so I remember going to high school graduation in Durant, Mississippi, which was one of the most impoverished school districts in the state. And I'm thinking all Black high school, all Black graduates. And I'm saying to myself, should be easy to go collect these signatures. And we were met with a lot of resistance because folks did not know what we were doing. And it wasn't until we met this young woman, this woman, Emma Butler. And so Ms. Butler says, what are you doing? And so we're collecting signatures. And before I could finish it, she said, oh, yeah, I just left a meeting. Yeah, come on, baby. And she tells me and the other 4 or 5 young men that's with me we changed our strategy from asking people to collect signatures to we just follow Ms. Butler, to the point where I don't think it was a person in the room who didn't sign the petition. I don't think it was a person who drove by who didn't stop to sign it because of Ms. Butler. But the reason why I bring that up is because as we talk about a place like Mississippi, where we've seen persistent poverty in, over 50 of the 82 counties for so many decades, and we've seen these issues that have just permeated for so many decades. When you organize in a place like Mississippi, it's not just about saying, here's what the data suggests, here's what we need to do, here's the technology. You have to organically connect the people to the mission, to the technology. And so what we were able to do during that initiative is not only did we able to collect close to 200,000 signatures, we began using various platforms like the Voter Activation Network. We were able to test out different technologies. We had a data-centric model where we were able to go after voters with surgical precision. The frustrating point about it, and I'll fast forward, is that the legislator put an alternative on the ballot for the first time in history. So instead of just voting for this citizen-driven amendment, you had to do 2 things. You had to either first vote whether or not you wanted to change the Constitution. And even if you decided, yes, no, I don't want to change the Constitution, you had a decision between the citizen-driven amendment and the legislative alternative. So very very much confusing. And what ended up happening, we lost the first one to change the Constitution by 22,828 votes. And so, that's a number I'll never forget. Saying all of that to say, organizing and what happened from that campaign to now is that there are, folks in rural Mississippi in just about every county that has been able to do organizing with technology, with their smartphones, et cetera. And that has led to a lot of local wins. And it also led to our last gubernatorial race being a 3-point race. And I hope that it also leads to the next one being one that we win.
One of the things that is kind of really interesting, one of the lessons I've learned the past 64 years, and I want to talk about 2024, because over the past 64 years, what I've learned is something you see as a solution, others see as a problem. They do not want you to get ahead. So we now are faced with MAGA, right? We've got the right to vote. We've got the right to do these things, but they want to take away the vote from us. We've got women have, had the right to control their bodies and so that they want to take that away from them. If you're a member of the LGBT community, they want to demonize you again. So now as you now try to put solutions forward as people see their problems, what kind of things are you hearing from the communities you're dealing with? Because they didn't have your experience. They just feel this stuff coming at them. They're getting overwhelmed. They're feeling, what should I be doing? Where should I be going? So what are you hearing in the 2024 kinds of discussions that you've been having and particularly with young people? What are they saying? What are they talking about?
Well, I will remind you before we go into this that the folks who will be voting for the first time in this election were born in 2006, right? Right. And so the world that they have seen is completely it just could not have even been imagined by some of our elders and folks who are doing this work with us. But one of the beautiful things about the SNCC legacy, as it informs my organizing, is that I trust the people and we listen to the people. And I'm listening to students, and I'm hearing that they're tired, that people they feel under attack, right? That when you think about just the demands on our time and our energy and our attention, and everything is expensive. And asking government doesn't feel like it's working like it should. The expectations of you go to school, you do well in school, you graduate from school, you get a job, it provides enough for you to have a decent life. You have some savings, you retire. That doesn't feel like it is accessible to them. And so there's a shift happening that I think people are feeling up under our feet. I think that, the uncommitted movement, for example, in the Democratic primaries, right, is a protest action within the Democratic Party. The student and campus organizing that we see, the solidarity encampments, in solidarity with what's happening in Gaza, that these young folks, because of the world that you all have created and that they have inherited, have an increased appetite for justice, an increased appetite for liberation, and they have organized demands. Because of the failures of our government to protect them, particularly our public school children, they've also had active shooter drills in middle schools and high schools. And so they know how to protect themselves against the state. And so what you are seeing is the legacy of direct action, the ambitions of people who love themselves and want better for themselves, coexisting in these young people that have, again, inherited the legacy of SNCC organizing and your contemporaries. And so it's going to be a hot summer, Brother Courtland, as we head to Chicago for the DNC. It's listen, folks should be not concerned, but people should be that thing that you're feeling, those hairs in the back of your neck about we don't know what's going to happen. I think that is real, and it's coming from a real place. And it will continue to be that way as long as we elect people who don't feel like they are accountable. Because we've also learned that from you as well, that you can get the vote and we can get people in there, but then we need to have an agenda. And so that's what the streets are saying right now. I have my popcorn ready, but I'm not being passive, right? I'm organizing, and I'm connected to communities, but I'm proud. Actually, I am tired. I am concerned about the rise of fascism, but mostly I'm proud about being a part of the unbroken chain, and carrying on the legacy of SNCC organizing.
So Charles, as you talk to young people, what kind of thing are you hearing? The similar things that NSA is having? Have you hearing other things? Because your situation, she's more urban and you're more rural. So what are you hearing?
First of all, stop trying to
Jackson,
create some divisions. Like, that's my dog.
I'm not saying that Jackson is rural.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that
Well,
you
Mississippi
travel outside the state and your responsibility as the state director, the executive director of the NAACP. So you're up in the Delta, you're down south. True. So what are you hearing?
Oh yeah, no. And let's be clear, Mississippi is a very rural state. I tell you, I'm nervous. I'm very nervous about this election because I know what's at stake. I think the next 50 years is at stake in 2024. We saw what transpired from 2016 to 2020. We saw a lot of hope in 2020. I text and say after the elections in Georgia, and I thanked her because I said to myself, I knew that the South had a story to tell and that people were going to listen differently. It's one of those scenarios where in this country, if we continue to ignore the South, we are doomed. If we continue to ignore the South, we're going to have an electoral map that's redder than it has to be. If we can continue to ignore the South, we're going to continue to have things like Roe v. Wade, things like the Voting Rights Act, pieces of that being struck down. And so we cannot ignore that. But what am I hearing? It's interesting. I think that there's a collective consciousness amongst young people that seems reminiscent of what I've heard about in the 60s, and I think that young people are also in a place where this emblematic movement doesn't excite them. They want action. Incremental action is not something that they are willing to accept. And what I try to do in those conversations is just to invite them to understand and know a little bit about history. But I want that fire. I want the frustration. And what I try to think about is the ultimate thing is recognizing that instead of moving from a position of protest, let's move from one of power. And so, and I just, define power as the ability to make a decision. And so that's the only guidance I try to give young people in this moment. And I tell you that if our leaders do not listen to young people in this election, we're going to be doomed for the next 50 years.
Can I add one more thing about this moment that I think is different from your organizing? I think that even though there were Black queer folks that were leading parts of the movement 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that there were obviously Black women deeply involved, that when we start thinking about gender and class as well as race, I don't think that there was the visibility, right? It was race first in a lot of ways. And when I think about particularly like young Black activists, there is just the space to include other fights that made it, I don't think that our predecessors felt like existed. Like there was an urgency and a singularity and a clarity about a racial justice agenda that made sense for the time that you were in. And the difference that I see in this moment, I see so many parallels, but one of the differences is that they have a little bit more space to talk about Black workers versus the Black wealthy, right? That there are opportunities to talk about the ways in which some policies impact Black women versus the way that they impact Black men. And I don't think that there was space for that 50, 60 years ago. But that's also very, very, very exciting for the fights and the organizing that has to happen and who we can bring with us in this moment.
Yeah, and say you're right. 50 or 60 years ago, our community was compressed. Everybody was in the same, whether you had a PhD or whether you had a GED. You were in the same place. You were in the same housing environment. You would ate the same kind of food and so forth. And now you have a situation where people can't afford food and they're Black billionaires. So you have a different reality. But one of the things that as I think about it, and I want to talk a bit about why the SNCC Legacy Project and the SNCC Digital Movement Platform is so important. Because I think at the end of the day, the most important fight that we should engage in is the ability to define. I mean, and that, that may sound strange because for me, on understanding it, if you don't win the ability to define, you've lost the battle. And what we see now in this country right now is who gets to define. I mean, we've been engaged in it for over 80 years, but who gets to define whether this country is going to be really geared to minority rule or really geared to majority rule. And because we have to make sure that this country is about majority rule, because if it's not about majority rule, we will not be included. And that's why I want to talk about when we look at the SNCC Digital Gateway and look at it putting all these documents, over 20,000 documents, photographs, and all kinds of things like that together, people have to see a history. Because one of the things, history is not an academic discussion. It's really a more profound human discussion. Because the sense of value, people create their own value. They create their own sense. And one of the things we talked about the other night was the British Empire. The King of England created, his own reality. Right. They told the stories. They told the various kinds of things that they want to have. And then they got people to believe in it. We have got to get people to understand and believe in majority rule. We've got to get people to understand at the end of the day that they're the ones who have to be the actors. They cannot wait on others to act. And one of the things that most difficult things that we now have to tell our communities, is at the end of the day, it's on you. You are the people who are going to have to make the definitions of the world. And so therefore, let's start not in any big concept about this, that, and the other. Let's start where you live. Let's start where you work. Let's start in your communities. And let's start in 2024. So one of the things I've been working with the NAACP and working with others is to make sure that we get 300,000 people who will volunteer to get the Black vote out. Because at the end of the day, while, and I don't want to offend Charles, while all states are equal, there are 12 states that are more equal than others, and these are the battleground states, and that we have to win. But we have to have a collective effort. And one of the things that we're working on, I'm working with both Charles and Ensei on, is this whole concept of Freedom Summer 60, where, in 1964, what we brought 1,000 people to Mississippi, and volunteers from across the country. Because one of the things that Bob Moses used to say is that when you're in Mississippi, you feel like you're in another country. And so at the end of the day, that what we did was we were able to use our muscle, our time and energy to make the fundamental difference. And I think at the end of the day, I think we're going to have to do the same kind of thing. We now have to view ourselves as the actors. We're going to have to define America. We're going to have to take the blows. And when you get into politics and when you get into economics, at the end of the day, it's really about war. It's really about making sure that your political and economic interests are there. So as we begin to talk to young people, and one of the things that both of you had is that, as you said earlier, and say, the vote is just not it. You've got to talk about political organizing. You got to talk about political participation. So I want you to talk about some of the elements, like doing your research, doing all those kinds of things that are necessary to have a cohesive force. Because what we're looking at the top, the people who want minority rule have billions of dollars.
Yep.
We now have to use our time and energy to counter that. So how do you now tell people they need to organize themselves in 2024 to make a difference in terms of their own interests? Their own interests. What are some of the things that they need to think about?
Yeah, I think, we can talk tactics, right? Like the phone calls, the emails, the social media posts, etc., the taking people to the polls. I think that one, there must be like a strategic conversation, all right, about what it is that you want for yourselves. Now, a lot of times people think about these things, they ask themselves these things, but when we start thinking about organizing a demand, sustaining that organized demand, that comes from organization. And as you can see, like one of these kids is not like the other. I did not get the suit memo today, but I got a gray suit. I could have showed up in uniform, so I'm not really a joiner. That's not my thing, right? And yes, I am a member of different organizations, and it's because that when there are competing professional obligations, competing personal obligations, and life is lifing, that I know that, people who share my values and care about the things that I care about are working on these issues over time, right? That I don't need to be a superhero. And I think that people need to find their political home. People need to find political organization for themselves in this moment. Because, one, we're human. Two, again, competing personal and professional obligations. Three, none of us do this alone. Four, every story that you've heard about, like the person who got up in his hard bottoms and his suit and gave the perfect speech, and that's how our rights was won, is a fairy tale, right? Mm-hmm. That it takes getting 1,000 people to Mississippi on planes, trains, and automobiles and keeping them safe as safe as you could. That is what brings about change, right? That it requires logistics, right? And people being good and using their skills, bringing their time, their talent, and their treasure. And so again, that happens over time, that happens in organization. And so you can still be a loner. I can still have my snacks and my phone, but I'm still coming to the meeting. And so if I had to distill the one thing, again, there's so many tactics and things that we could talk about. Our ancestor now, Hollis Watkins Jr. was invoked earlier, and I'm thinking about freedom songs and joy and culture and how important that is to sustaining people's spirits. And we've also inherited that legacy from SNCC and SNCC leaders as well. So yeah, I think that's organization, having a political home, finding your people, finding your tribe, people who share your values and who care very much about, the books down at Mulberry Elementary School, or access to water, clean water in Jackson that people can afford, right? Or being able to get reproductive health care in a place like Alabama or Georgia. So, yes, get you a crew.
Yeah, well, let me just add one thing to you, Charles. Since so NSA's looked at the political plan, I don't want to ask you, so if you were talking to your peers, right, and you have a great deal of influence in Mississippi, and you said to them, and they asked you, what should you be doing in order to make a difference? It does seem to me that understanding the budgets, the municipal budgets, the state budgets, the federal budgets, and beginning to go where the action is, because at the end of the day, people's belief where they expend the money. So if you started talking to them as part of the work of being part of the movement, you're talking now about budgets and things like that. What would they say to you?
I wonder what they would say. And I tell you, though, what I think the approach should be, because oftentimes that kind of conversation comes up in this question of accountability.
Right.
And they'll say, we need to hold our elected officials, our appointed officials accountable. And, that's always rubbed me a bit the wrong way, because I think it's not about accountability. It's about co-governance. Okay. Now, if somebody is a bad actor, then we need to get a bad actor out of the way. But the reality is that in a place like Mississippi, where you have more black elected officials than any other state in the country, very different from the reality of 1964, when there were, I don't think any, if maybe one or two. I know Robert Clark was the first in the House Representative 67, but needless to say, oftentimes you got good people in these offices that just don't know, that need help. And so when I would say, how can you plug in? How can you help? I would say, let's figure out how can you co-govern, because it doesn't always have to be just the elected, just the appointed. Many times they need those helps. And the second piece of that is we really have to look at a hyper local reality and a hyper local strategy. We control a lot, but we leave a lot on the table because as we are grasping for more, we don't take advantage of what we already have power.
Well, I think over the last 80 years, I think we've made a big difference. We have now, come to the point where we have political leverage in order to advance our economic gains. I think this is an ongoing conversation. One of the things we want to do over the next 15 weeks is to have many more conversations about what we should be doing, where we should be going, what the history has been, and how you can build on that history so we can move forward. So I think one of the things that, from my perspective, is that the most important thing that we can do, just like me, I needed to get out that card room and become an actor. And I think, whatever card room you're in, as you begin to become a political actor, an economic actor, and not just voting, you've got to be able to do a number of things that both Nsé described and both Charles described. We've got to, this is a big thing. This country is about what we are going to make it. At the end of the day, you've got to get that in your head. This country is about what we will make it. Nsé, you have any, comments that you can close out with?
Yeah, thank you. I can't wait to hear more from you. I think that connecting the work that we're doing, you know how they say that the arc of the moral universe is long, but that it bends towards justice. And when that gets evoked, people are often trying to describe the work that they're doing to bend the arc. So like, how are you laboring? What is your thing? I have recently been thinking about the long part, that it is long. I thought we'd be done with a lot of this shit by now. Pardon my language. And so just honestly, please, a political home, find one. There are tons of organizations that exist who would love to have you, who need your time, your talent, and your treasure. And so I would encourage you all to find a political home before this election, and think about voting and like, what else are you doing? What skills do you have? What commitments can you make to bringing about the world that you want for yourself and your family?
Yeah, Charles, you got any closing thoughts?
A quote that's been on my mind a lot lately is from Zora Neale Hurston, and she said that if you're silent about if we're silent about our pain, they'll kill us and say we enjoyed it. And so, one thing that I'm proud about now is that I'm seeing young people who are not remaining silent in this moment. I feel confident and I feel hopeful that we're going to have a better future, a brighter future. As we talk about the South as a whole, as it relates to this election cycle, oftentimes there is a conversation of let's be in these 12 battleground states that matter. And I agree 1,000%. But I also say, think about it like an investment portfolio. You can't ignore your long-term gains for the short ones. And so I think we have to figure out a way to do both. And I think this is the right moment to do it.
Well, I agree with you, and I think this is the first in a series of discussions that we're going to be having. Next week we'll be having another number of other people who will be discussing other issues, but particularly all of them focused on how does the Black community become the actors? How does the Black community become the decision makers in this country? We do not need to complain because the people who you're complaining to or about don't care. They know better than you what they're doing. You have to be the actor, and you're going to have to make the difference.
For full biographies, additional resources, and B-roll clips, visit our website at www.snclegacyproject.org.